From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morningline with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morningline. I'm Nick Barris. It is Tuesday, and this is a live program after we've had a couple of taped shows. I was out of town, but I'm back at it, and boy, a lot happened since I've been gone, specifically internationally. We're going to talk this morning I want to do this as much as for me as for you in terms of getting up to speed on what we see happening in Afghanistan. Why we were there originally, to where we are today now with the U.S. pulling everything out, and the Afghani forces we were supposed to be training basically just folding, boom. And the Taliban basically in position now to take over that entire country, and what it means not only for the population there, but also what it means for the rest of the world in the United States with regard to terrorism and everything else. It's a disturbing situation, and you wonder where we go from here. We're going to talk about it this morning with an expert who's followed this, who has an expertise in it because one of his specialties is international foreign policy, political science, and the like. And Professor Thomas Schwartz is joining us from Vanderbilt this morning. Good morning to you, Professor. How are you?
Good, Nick. Thank you for having me on the program.
Yeah, I hope people find this interesting. I have to admit, as I was traveling this weekend, was out of town and the like, I picked up snippets as we went, and certainly I'm aware of what's happened. But it made me stop and think, okay, we see what is going on right now. And the image that sticks with me from this weekend is that giant C-130 getting ready to take off from the airport there, I guess, and all of these Afghanis grabbing hold of the craft while it's trying to take off. And apparently one of them, as it took off, and you see this video, we've all seen it, took off with 3 on board or 3 holding on outside, and they fell to their deaths. They're this desperate to leave the country. And just so much. And it made me think, though, back to remind myself why we were there in the first place. So much of a history in Afghanistan. Professor, were we there to try to go in, push out the existing leadership there and build a democracy? Or are we there basically just to go in and fight the war on terrorism with the idea of eventually leaving and having something else there, maybe not a democracy, but killing terrorism? What was the purpose of being there 20 plus years ago?
Well, I hate to put it this way, but it kind of depends on who you ask. In a sense, if you ask Joe Biden, he'd say we were only there to fight terrorism. When we killed Osama bin Laden, it was all over. But in fact, of course, that was not the case. We went into Afghanistan because Afghanistan was where bin Laden was, where the 9/11 attacks were planned. The Taliban government gave bin Laden shelter, encouraged him, allowed him to conduct terrorism around the world. And so we went in order to disrupt that, to get rid of that base of operations, and to secure the country against renewal of terrorism. Now, the problem is that once you go into a country and you knock down the existing structures, you could leave immediately, but then you've got anarchy and the possibility that the terrorists will be back. So we ended up staying. And in staying, we decided to try to do some reforms and bring about a better government and society for Afghanistan, to allow women to be educated, to allow children to go to school, to set up a viable economic structure, to hook up the country to the World Wide Web, all of those sorts of things, and to try and bring about a type of democracy. And we did. It was a very flawed democracy. The government was frequently accused of and undoubtedly corrupt in many respects, but it was better than the Taliban. And in this sense, it was certainly better for our interests than the Taliban, but we did end up staying much longer than anyone projected because of this. It also is clear that we stayed because, in effect, there was not a strong movement to get us to bring people home. Remember that if the comparison is made to Vietnam, one has to think, yes, there was strong protest to get troops home. Afghanistan never really saw that. Most Americans really knew little about the conflict and didn't pay very much attention to it after the initial overthrow of the Taliban and then the killing of Osama bin Laden. So there wasn't a strong demand to get out. Even though some presidents, of course, talked about ending the war. Obama did. Trump did, and now Biden, of course, did.
Okay, so let's talk about, whose, I guess, responsibility this is. Certainly, Joe Biden is the president right now, so the buck stops there with him, that he moved forward and said, okay, let's do this. We're pulling out. This war is over for us, and we're going to take him out. But that, let's keep in mind, was there not an agreement made under President Trump with the country that we're going to pull out? And as you said, President Obama did the same. So you have, 3 presidents in a row talking that way. Ultimately, it comes down to Biden, but they all were saying that this was going to happen, and President Trump actually reached an agreement with that. Because a lot of people pointing fingers, and I think it's maybe safe to point a finger at our current president and say, well, this could have been done better, perhaps, but it certainly wasn't his idea.
No, that's certainly the case. Of course, in fairness to President Trump, lots of his agreements President Biden has thrown out. I mean, President Biden went back into the Paris Climate. He didn't feel compelled to adhere to anything Trump did. He did this one because he did want to get out of Afghanistan. This is Joe Biden's decision. So
that's on him. And let's then talk about, how he maybe made that decision and what we saw happening over the past 48 hours or so, especially with that video we showed a moment ago. It sounds to me like in Afghanistan, clearly there's a large portion of that population that maybe is fearful of the Taliban, especially obviously the women, and they don't want to deal with it. And then all of a sudden their protectors are leaving, some of them maybe who knew they were complicit with Americans. What kind of future do many of those Afghanis face now? And, how this, I guess the big surprise is that the military that we thought we were training was just awful and collapsed. I mean, what the heck's going on there?
Well, that's a more complicated story than you suggest. I mean, we trained a military in our image. We were intertwined with that military, with contractors and the rest who provided air support and backup. When we deserted that military, we really left them in the lurch. And they made what may seem to us as cowardly decisions, but I think were perfectly rational decisions, that they weren't going to fight if they couldn't win and prevail. And they decided to lay down their arms. But we cut them off at the knees. So it's not quite the situation that President Biden described. It was always going to be difficult, but we created a military in our image and reliant on our support, and then we suddenly cut them off.
Right.
We left bases in the middle of the night. We left in a very disorganized and very poorly planned fashion. Okay,
and I hear you on that. So if that's indeed the case, then clearly, I mean, Biden and the intelligence he was getting, they had to know that this military was not. I mean, I'm just guessing that's the case. I mean, if you're correct and it was supported and we just pulled out, and if those military leaders that were trained there themselves knew that if Americans pull out, we aren't going to be able to handle this ourselves. I find it hard to believe that, American intelligence didn't know this, and they did it anyway then. They said, look.
Well, American intelligence, you got to, at least the decision-making in the Biden administration on this, as the New York Times article the other day made out, it's clear President Biden overruled his military and intelligence leaders on this. They did warn him. But he wanted out. He wanted out of Afghanistan. He wanted out as quickly as possible. And so he overruled that. So it's not simply a question of we didn't predict it. It's a question of political judgment. Yeah. And in fact, the Biden administration, I think, wanted this to be celebrated as a success. They originally planned to have the pullout by 9/11 and be able to celebrate that they ended America's longest war on the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks. I think this was very misguided and a very poor judgment, but I think that's what prevailed more than simply intelligence errors.
Okay, and based on the way things play out, no matter what, when something like this happens, there's going to be criticism, there's going to be politics that become involved. But big picture, all right, I'm sitting here, there's a bunch of people at home watching this program sitting here, and how is that going to affect us? The fact, I mean, tangibly here, the fact that we pulled out, I mean, because the way I look at it, in some, I don't want to see another American life die in Afghanistan for what appears to have been over the past 20 years something that I'm not convinced was worth it to begin with. So I'm good with our American troops being home because I don't think it's worth having a single one of our American soldiers die over there again. So in that regard, I'm on board with Biden. Pull them back. But on the other hand, I do worry by doing this, all right, Taliban takes charge of the country. Is this going to increase the threat of terrorism across the globe? That's kind of where I'm trying to get a handle on what does it mean to the average American. We may be outraged right now, but in a couple weeks we're going to forget about it and not care.
Well, yes, that's probably the case, but I do think this does heighten the possibility of another 9/11. It gives terrorism a sanctuary. And even though it may have seemed that Afghanistan wasn't worth the bones of another American soldier, as the famous quote from Bismarck about German commitments during that time, I think you could make the case that we had achieved a stalemate. We kept Afghanistan from becoming a base of terror, and we had materially improved the lives of thousands and millions of Afghanis. So as difficult as this, I think we could have stayed. We had not lost anyone. No American soldier had died in Afghanistan for almost 2 years before this recent withdrawal. So it was a low-cost commitment, similar to the cost of commitment, say, to South Korea, which we preserved as a viable and economically dynamic society in the wake of what is constant threats from North Korea. So I don't think it should be presented as polarized. I think the president has presented it in an emotional manner in order to win support for his position, but I think he's being very deceptive in doing that.
And again, before we go to break then, if it was a low-cost proposition and if you believe that American troops weren't really at great risk there, at least not of late, the motivation to do this right now, why was it high on this president's list? I mean, really, what's to be gained from it? If he was thinking this is going to get me a bunch of support and people are going to love it, well, he blew that. I mean, it may play out down the road that it's not that big a deal, but I mean, why do this then, in your mind? I guess.
Well, actually, Nick, public opinion polls showed 60 to 70% of Americans wanted to get out of Afghanistan. I don't think those polls are quite what people think, in the sense that I don't think many people paid much attention, and so they were asked the question, they just said, yes, let's get out. But I think they were thinking that this was going to be a politically popular move, ending America's endless wars. This is something Donald Trump talked about all the time. Politically, it didn't seem to be a high-cost thing because the Republicans had largely also abandoned Afghanistan. At least if my calculations are correct, the Biden administration was seeing this politically. I also think Joe Biden has been very opposed to the Afghanistan conflict from almost the beginning, not quite the beginning, but he has been opposed to any continuing commitment there for a long time. So this was an opportunity for him to carry out something that he believed for a long period of time.
Very interesting. All right, listen, taking a break here. When we come back, Professor, we've got some phone calls, Rodney and others, if you're on there. I'd like to hear your thoughts. A lot of people have opinions on this, and, really maybe share with us what you think it means to you down the road. Do you really care one way or the other as we see some of this? And certainly a big story. We'll be back with more with our professor and your phone calls right after this.